start or sit for week 12, and we are focusing in on flex options this week. Who should you trust and who should you avoid in your fantasy lineups? And last week was fun, guys. We talked about avoiding Xavier Worthy, trusting Christian Watson, leaning into the high risk play of Tre Tucker, coming back and trusting Tyrone Tracy Jr. and Parker Washington. We're not going to talk about that one. But I have got you a fresh new batch of flex options this week. So let's go ahead and dive right in. We do not have official confirmation of Brian Thomas Jr.'s availability as of the filming of this video, but he did practice on a limited basis multiple times last week. And typically that does mean that a player was pretty close to returning and maybe the team wanted to hold him additional week there just to make sure that he was good to go. So if Brian Thomas Jr. does play, we will have yet another weekly shakeup of the Jags receiving core. It has been like this every single week for like months now. Jakobi Meyers shifted to the Jags' top producer in the receiving core in week 11. Then the 2 games prior to that were dominated by Parker Washington. Before that, we had the emergence of Travis Hunter. The last time we saw success for Brian Thomas Jr. was way back in week 6. It has been well over a month since he has made any contribution to the offense. We have to be very certain from the Jags that he would play a full amount of snaps and there would be no issue for us to trust him in our starting lineups. But regardless, we do have to also account for his return for how it affects Jakobi Meyers. Now, week 11 was the first time that Jakobi Meyers was fully integrated into the Jags offense, and he had a solid performance given the difficulty level of the matchup there. This week's performance against Arizona, far more agreeable to the pass. But there is a slight problem. Teams facing the Cardinals have consistently won on the ground. That is less about the Cardinals having an incredibly strong pass defense and more about the fact that opposing teams are jumping out on the Cardinals offensively very early, and then they are able to lean on the run. So when you combine the return potentially of Brian Thomas Jr. and the likelihood of the Jags leaning aggressively on the run in this matchup, any Jags receiver is a risky start this week. Jacksonville has steadily increased their reliance on the ground game over the past several weeks, and the Jags running backs combined for 42 carries last week. If they lean on the run again here, Meyers would offer very limited upside this week. Week 11 was a fantastic day for fantasy managers who took a chance on Tre Tucker as a starter against Dallas. While there was a clear improvement from Dallas's defense, I will give them that. The additional personnel looked very good there. Tucker had a strong performance, and he had 4 receptions on 8 targets for 47 yards and a touchdown. We were happy there. Tucker had been the theoretical wide receiver 1 this entire season for Vegas, and he was expected to step up even further and be more consistent with Jakobi Meyers traded. His first matchup without Meyers was against Denver, and it was a rough one. It was not good. It was Tyler Lockett that was the most productive receiver. Tucker reclaimed his spot this week, but the big question that we have here is, even as the wide receiver 1 for Vegas, is he actually playable on a weekly basis, or is he just matchup dependent? This week's matchup, the Week 12 matchup against Cleveland, definitely leans more towards Denver than it does towards Dallas. The Browns are a top 10 defense in terms of fewest fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, and they have been a nightmare matchup for opposing quarterbacks, which likely means that we are in for an awful performance from Geno Smith. It is tough to imagine a scenario where the Raiders' offensive line can handle Myles Garrett and company. Despite the strong Week 11 performance here, Tre Tucker is an incredibly risky start this week due to matchup. Kenneth Walker is coming off his best performance of the season, oddly enough, in the Seahawks' most difficult defensive matchup of the season against the LA Rams. Even including Walker's solid Week 11 performance, the Rams have allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. So to see Walker finally break through in this matchup was really remarkable here. Prior to Week 11, Walker had 5 straight games of fewer than 10 fantasy points in full PPR. He wasn't struggling in terms of efficiency, but the Seahawks had been truly committed to a committee and were steadfast about red zone work going to Zach Charbonnet to the point where anytime they would get close to the goal line, no matter if Kenneth Walker was the one that brought them there, they would pull him and put in Zach Charbonnet, who became a touchdown magnet with 6 on the season in just 9 games. Walker's last touchdown prior to this past week was week 3, and that was a game where Charbonnet was out. Mike McDonald said that after Walker's Week 11 performance, he had showcased that he is earning more opportunities to get the ball. That's an odd statement, in my opinion, for a proven lead back who has not been struggling, but nonetheless, it is a critical statement implying that we should see an increase in Walker's workload. However, do we trust Mike McDonald's words here? This week's matchup against Tennessee should be a great opportunity for Seattle to lean on the run and be a high upside game for Walker. The Titans have allowed the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. They are friendly across the board, and this game should result in ample goal line opportunities. The only question is, are those opportunities truly going to go to Kenneth Walker? Naturally, we are seeing a gap in rankings between fantasy analysts who are fully on board with this reemergence and they're all in, they're back in on Kenneth Walker, and those who are a little bit more skeptical. However, given the injuries and lack of depth at running back, Walker might be a little bit risky this week, but I lean more towards the trust area for him. He is a potential must start this week. The Woody Marks experience has been a roller coaster, and trust me, I've been on it because I roster him in quite a few places here. He is oscillated between 15 to 2 to 15 to 6 fantasy points over the past 4 weeks. However, what increases our view of leaning into Woody Marks, despite having a very underwhelming performance last week, is that the Texans are finally treating him as the lead back in back-to-back weeks. In Week 10 against Jacksonville, Marks had 14 carries. In Week 11 against Tennessee, he had 18 carries. While the results from a fantasy perspective last week were underwhelming in what should have been an advantageous matchup, we can take solace in the fact that all signs are pointing towards the snaps and the carries, clearly indicating that Nick Chubb is no longer a factor in this offense. Rather than starting a running back that feels like we have an unknown workload level, let's take the chance on actually trusting Woody Marks as the lead back in a good matchup against Buffalo, and it is a good matchup. The Buffalo Bills' run defense has been their Achilles heel all season. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs and have given up a ridiculous amount of touchdowns to the point where even running backs like Ollie Gordon, Kendre Miller, and Chuba Hubbard after the emergence of Rico Dowdle have all gotten touchdowns. And then countless other high-end running backs have also had touchdowns against the Bills. They've just been lighting it up all season against the Bills. The Bills have also struggled to separate themselves offensively, and outside of a few logical outliers, their games tend to remain fairly close enough to where you don't actually have to abandon the run, so this all does make a lot of sense. The Texans will be starting Davis Mills again. We would obviously feel more comfortable if C.J. Stroud were at quarterback, but the Texans' defense should ensure that this game remains fairly close, and Marks should get a hefty workload again. Last week was a disappointing outing for Wan'Dale Robinson. We expected Jameis Winston at quarterback to have a significant increase in pass volume. Unfortunately, weather was an issue in this game, and it was also a difficult matchup here, so Winston only threw for 201 passing yards. However, for safety purposes, Wan'Dale Robinson was once again the target leader in the Giants receiving corps and has been the clear wide receiver 1 ever since they lost Malik Neighbors. Robinson has 88 targets on the season, and in 4 of the past 5 games, he has had between 9 and 12 targets. He's a high-volume guy here. And while it's been a while since we have seen a ceiling game from him, he has been a very safe play in terms of having a solid floor in PPR in particular due to targets and receptions. This week's matchup against Detroit should encourage volume. The Lions have one of the league's best run defenses, and their offense should definitely pick apart the Giants' defense, meaning that more than likely the Giants will be chasing points and will have to increase volume in this matchup. At this point, we're unsure of 100% who we're going to have at quarterback, but regardless of who is the starter, this is likely a double-digit target game for Wan'Dale Robinson again. There's not a ton to talk about on this one. The concept is pretty basic. Ja'Marr Chase is suspended, and we all know exactly why, so I don't really think I need to explain that one, but T. Higgins will clearly ascend to the wide receiver 1, and Andrei Iosivas will step in as the wide receiver 2. Iosivas is in his third year with the Bengals. Obviously, he has been the wide receiver 3 over his entire career because he has been playing with Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins. But the Bengals like him, they trust him, and when he is called upon, he does answer. And for somebody who has played a extremely limited usage in his career, he has had a surprising amount of touchdowns, 10 total touchdowns in his 2 previous seasons. Now, there's no real inherent risk here with him because the Bengals primarily run 3 wide receiver sets, so he is typically on the field between 60 to 90% of snaps anyway, and they've got a matchup against the New England Patriots defense that is extremely rough against the run and average against the pass. Opposing offenses just prefer to attack them through the air, and as we discussed with Mack Hollins, Drake May should tear this offense apart, meaning that this is going to be a high volume pass game for Cincinnati. This is the same concept of why I liked Michael Wilson last week. There are only so many targets that can be thrown to T. Higgins. Even if you tossed a good 20 his way, someone else has to catch the ball. Andrei Iosivas is a viable flex option this week. We talked about this in the waiver wire video. Greg Dortch is on the table for as long as Marvin Harrison Jr. is out. This concept is very straightforward. Jakobi Brissett has been on fire in terms of producing volume, and that is all that we care about for our fantasy purposes. He has thrown a minimum of 31 pass attempts in all 5 of his starts this season. 3 of those 5 starts have been 44, and 57 attempts. Mathematically, that means a third receiving option has to be involved. And again, if Marvin Harrison Jr. is out, that makes Greg Dortch the third receiving option. Dortch had 6 receptions on 6 targets for 66 yards and a touchdown. Now, this week's matchup against the Jags is very pass-friendly. Just ignore that messy performance from the Chargers last week that they had against the Jags. We talked about that. That was less about the Jags defense and more about the Chargers offensive line. Even Geno Smith and Davis Mills went off against the Jags. Volumes should flow in this matchup. They are a very pass-friendly matchup, and Greg Dortch, therefore, is a low-end flex option. Mack Hollins' viability and safety as a starter here is dependent on Kayshon Boutte's status for Week 12. However, it is important to note that Drake May has been pushing heavier volume to the receiving court as well. Earlier in the season, we saw May really spreading the ball around, leaning heavily on tight ends. The receivers have shifted to having the higher advantage over the past month and a half or so, and while Kayshon Boutte's presence would definitely have an impact on Mack Hollins' snap count, it might not actually have a significant impact on his volume. Boutte was operating on very low volume in terms of targets and delivering on touchdowns in particular. Outside of Week 1, Kayshon Boutte has had a maximum of 5 targets in a single game this season. So given the matchup, Hollins could still see a suitable level of volume and be a low-end flex option. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Be sure to follow me across all social media platforms at It's Tara Time, and make sure that you're locked in, subscribe, turn on notifications, all that good stuff, because I've got fantasy football content coming to you all season long and in the off season as well, so stick around. I've got you covered every week. Waiver wire, stashes, trades, live shows with Q&A where you can ask me any questions that you got, and so much more.